In his testimony before Congress in 1912, 1 year before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, J.P. Morgan said this: "Gold is money, everything else is credit." And central banks know this. This is why they store it. And I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about why central banks hold gold. So let's explore. This video I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and if you enjoy content like this, I hope you consider subscribing to the channel and maybe engaging in the comment section and pressing that thumbs up button. But gold is a metal that central banks have been buying for quite a long time. Now, what's fascinating about gold is that its role is central and has been for the central banks for a number of years. In fact, in April of 2019, the Central Bank of Central Banks deemed it a Tier 1 asset, up from a Tier 3 asset. That puts it on par and equal to cash reserves. And that's right, is equal to the dollar in terms of the central banks. And I think that's pretty fascinating. Of course, we really didn't need that designation to know that or to recognize that. This is why central banks around the world have largely held on to gold. I'm going to be referencing in part here an article by the London Bullion Market Association that actually talks a little bit about this, by James Steele. And I think this is quite a fascinating story here about gold. They have a long history, and its use as gold as money predates the established monetary authorities by 1,000 years or so. The use of gold by central banks has played a key role in shaping the modern world. The great period of global economic expansion between the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which occurred in 1815, Waterloo, and the First World War, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand started that. It was arguably made possible in part by the introduction of the gold standard, a monetary system where a country's currency has a value directly tied to gold. The resulting currency stability allowed for a remarkable period of expanding trade and global investment. This dovetailed with the opening of massive gold deposits in the Americas, South Africa, and throughout Asia and Australia, which compounded global expansion by effectively greasing the world's money supply. The system was largely policed by the Bank of England and the cooperation of other central banks. This ended the onslaught of the First World War as the most belligerent nations suspended the free convertibility of gold. In the interwar period, the reestablishment of a gold standard by some nations met with mixed successes. At the beginning of the 30s, more and more countries were compelled to abandon the gold standard under the strains and stresses of the Great Depression. And this is always saw this expansion of the British Empire as well too. And you know what? When it all comes down to it, what's happening now, aside from some of this history, which we're going to continue with here in a moment, is more and more people, individuals, are buying gold. It's a part of the culture in most Eastern nations. Western nations, it's catching on too. In fact, this person here is who's presenting this video is going to be unboxing another gold piece here. So stay tuned as I go through this video. We'll unbox this later and see what I got to add to the stack, to my own personal holdings. Because you know what I always say, be your own central bank. Because we can't trust the governments. We have to trust ourselves and God. In fact, it's really the other way around. We should trust God first and then ourselves second. But nonetheless, after World War II, the Bretton Woods system was established, with gold once again playing a key role in policies adopted by the world's major central banks. Bretton Woods was based on the implicit pegging of currencies to gold. The currencies of participating central banks were pegged either to the US dollar or to gold directly, but mostly the dollar. The system worked as the US held vast amounts of gold as reserves. The ensuing currency stability played a large role in securing the post-war economic recovery. The Bretton Woods system effectively collapsed in 1971 due to inherent contradictions and tensions in the system. Freed from the constraints of Bretton Woods, gold rallied considerably for the rest of the decade, boosted largely by double-digit inflation as central banks pursued expansionary policies. The end of Bretton Woods resulted in gold no longer playing a central role in the international financial system, moving bullion from the center stage of central bank policies, priorities. Now, one thing I will say through that, what had occurred is the United States stored a lot of gold for other nations. We also had a lot more than the 8,100 tons that we've got now. I think we had about 20,000 tons when you include gold from other nations. And we stopped the convertibility into gold in 1971 because people wanted the gold back. France was a huge part of that. And this article doesn't talk about that. But anyways, more than 5 decades after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, gold continues to play a useful role in the international financial system and forms a notable share of global foreign exchange reserves. Purchases of gold by the official sector are an important component of gold demand. Collectively, central banks are the world's largest holders of bullion, and the sales of and purchasing decisions can have a significant impact on prices. And I think that's part of the reason why we saw gold climb so high in the last few years. Every independent central bank in the world holds at least some amount of bullion. Gold status as a currency has therefore borne out by the fact that bullion is counted as part of central banks' foreign exchange reserves. It is the only commodity currency to have survived as money into the electronic age, and that's important to understand. Let me repeat that. It is the only commodity-based currency, in other words, money, to have survived as such into the electronic age. This implies gold's unique monetary status. With that being said, I can't wait because I think it's a good idea, and I put out a challenge earlier for even the most ardent of silver stackers to save up to buy at least 1 full ounce of gold. It's tough to do, especially with gold well above $1,900 an ounce as of the recording of this video. But we're going to move this away and see what the other addition is here to the holdings here. See what we've got inside of this package. Yes, indeed. This comes to us from Monument Metals, and they have introductory pricing for these. Is what I consider to be premium gold, but although at a bullion price, it is the newest Dragon bar. Yes, indeed, there it is. And this is actually right side up, if I'm not mistaken. No, that's the way to tell. There's the obverse. The queen side is always the obverse. This is the first memorialized effigy ever put out by a bullion in bullion. It is now on all the world's major mints except for the Royal Mint, United Kingdom. But that's a story for another video. But this is the newest in the series of dragons. And there it is. Beautiful, beautiful. I love the design of this particular piece for 2023, the 2023 dragon here. And let's put that in place. And part of the reason why I wanted to get the dragon too is to make this point in the continuing saga about what you need to know about central banks buying gold. Folks in the East buy gold as part of their culture. You know, here in the United States, we used to actually have gold circulate as money. And of course in other countries around the world too that occurred. But nonetheless, here in the United States, it was in $20 gold pieces. Eastern nations, you may have had bars, coin bars. These are coin bars. But nonetheless, the other thing, what happened is people accumulate gold jewelry, gold in other forms, especially in India in terms of part of their culture for wedding ceremonies and the like. But you also see it in China and other Eastern nations. Gold is just a part of it. The vast majority of gold held in the world is by individuals, not central banks. But what central banks do, they have the largest amount of bullion, but nonetheless, gold is in so many different forms, some of which you can see here, but the jewelry is the biggest thing. And I think it's quite profound out there. And so it's pretty exciting to see how valued gold is, and central banks buying it just legitimizes it as being that stable store of value out there. Remarkable and fascinating and encouraging as well, too, I believe. Nonetheless, more than 5 decades after this collapse, central banks are being the largest holders of bullion, but we know it's backed by the people. The people make up the countries for these bullion. In fact, if you look at gold reserves as a percentage of the total reserves that are held in central banks, it has gone down dramatically, especially since the Bretton Woods and the closing of the gold window in 1971. In fact, there was a time where advanced economies had 80% of their reserves held in gold. 80%. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Over the course of time, 80% of the reserves held in gold. Nowadays, it is about 10%, in terms of all the advanced economies around the world and what they hold. What do they have, the reserves and others? They have reserves held in foreign currencies. And a lot, 60%, hold the dollar. The dollar itself plays a huge role. It is the most stable of the currencies out there in spite of inflation, because they're comparing it to other currencies out there. Pretty remarkable. Now, last year, central banks, and this is in 2022, accumulated gold at the most rapid pace since 1967, a period when the Bretton Woods system was drawing to a close. The official sector has not always been a bullion buyer. However, where can we trace the comeback of gold with regards to central bank utility and interest? A long series of central bank gold sales beginning in 1991 began to peer out of the early part of this century. The official end of the Cold War in 1991 reduced geopolitical risk and ushered in an era of increased global trade and prosperity, which seemed to consign gold to the back burner. After decades of sales, central banks turned buyers at the end of 2009, according to data from the Bank of International Settlements. The global financial crisis of 2008 seems to have brought back gold to investors' attention, including central banks. The end of mass central bank selling, almost exclusively Western European central banks who built up gold reserves during the Cold War, removed a significant negative from the bullion market. And by the way, the United States has not added a single ounce, according to official records, and we stand at 8,133.5 tons. I believe that is hubris on our part, because when you look at the countries, the next 6 countries coming together, they have far more gold than we do. Most of these nations make up the BRICS, save for Germany, but Italy, Russia, and China, and India certainly do make up the BRICS, and they have a desire, at least, to form a trade currency based off of gold. And right now, they could put something together that could compete. For sure. Germany is the second largest holder, and that is essentially the host nation for the euro. And the euro is a currency that many feel would have been competed with the dollar to some extent, but really, in a sense, it's kind of just in concert with, considering the G7 nations and the trade that we've seen between nations. Fascinating. But when you look about that, the United States not adding any more, and other nations that have sold throughout the course of time, well, let's talk a little bit about that. You had 2 nations that are of note. We had China that sold off, we had Canada that sold off all of their gold holdings, every single ounce, well, save for, some say, according to one report back in 2016, that says they have 77 whole ounces left. I think that's an important number to remember, because 77 ounces is largely attainable by most investors out there who want to protect their wealth. Even though it may seem like a long shot for some, at least it's an attainable goal to reach for, that you can say you've got more gold than Canada. Then you have what Prime Minister Gordon Brown did, I think in 2002, when he sold off gold at its low. At under about $252 an ounce, he sold off a large portion of the United Kingdom's gold reserves. He's been better off keeping it, that's for sure. But I digress. One of the most interesting features of a central bank gold reserves is the broad, varied, and unequal distribution of holdings. On average, governments hold about 10% of their official reserves as gold now, but this varies widely, as we've talked about. The U.S. and Japan are significant holders, with the U.S. being the world's largest official sector, as we've talked about here. And we have the Central Bank Gold Agreement signatories, which are a subset of the Euro area, sold about 30% of all central bank gold. Members of this group were significant sellers in the 90s and the first decade of this century. And their sales patterns played a role at the bear market for much of that period, and why the prices were down there at that time. But let's get into some of the functionality and some of the reasons why central banks hold gold. But before we get to that, we also talk about why they may sell gold, like the Central Bank of Turkey doing so, is because they're selling it essentially back to the people. And because the people in Turkey recognize, and they don't trust their currencies either. A lot of them literally put it under their mattresses. I've actually talked about that in a video. The Turkish people are extremely smart. They know the deal because they go through a currency crisis, which seems like every couple of years. So what's the rationale behind a central bank maintaining existing holdings or increasing gold reserves? And what has triggered a renewed period of bullion purchases? While gold no longer plays a pivotal role in international finance, it is still regarded as a valuable component of a nation's foreign exchange reserves. Some of the reasons that reserve managers choose to hold gold include portfolio diversification. That's right. It can serve as a diversifier that reduces the risk of holding currencies and debt instruments of other nations, especially when those currencies are in huge trouble from quantitative easing and the like. Gold purchases can be a way of reducing dollar holdings as well, too. You've heard that term de-dollarization, which is all the rage these days. We are seeing it happen in real time now. And it is becoming an increasing reason in recent years. Then you have the reduction of risk. You get that with diversification for sure, but risk reduction, it does not have any counterparty risk, which means that holding gold does not bring you any credit risk. And it also can be used for international payments. It can be utilized as a balance of payments crisis such as occurred in the 1997 through 1998 Asian crisis, and can be utilized to cover essential imports or shore up domestic currency. It can also serve as a collateral for loans. That's right. Then we have emergency funding. Gold is reliable in emergencies, in times of a national emergency or conflict when national currencies may not be redeemable. Gold can be mobilized. It can also provide a legacy. Many developed market central banks hold substantial amounts of gold by way of legacy dating from decades ago. And in a sense, that's what the United States could have. Of course, many here don't believe we actually have the gold in our coffers. But nonetheless, if you believe it's there, we've had that 8,133 tons for quite a long time. That's legacy gold for sure. Then it's about prestige. In the case of some central banks, there may be a tendency to emulate other gold holdings. And so that is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Now, some central banks, such as the People's Bank of China and Reserve Bank of India, are moving up the leagues and tables in terms of central bank gold ownerships. Although some smaller central banks may hold relatively low amounts of physical gold, this may still translate into a large percentage of their total reserves, given correspondingly low currency reserves. You've heard me talk about on this channel multiple times about how some of these smaller nations are buying gold, and it's smart to do so, even if it's just a couple hundred tons. Every little bit helps, or even just a couple of tons. Every little bit helps. Despite its antiquity, gold is still useful and a robust component of a central bank's portfolio, and holdings in many central banks are far from static. Reserve managers' allocation decisions regarding gold depend on a myriad of factors, including policy objectives, risk tolerance, cost, and other things, but bullion status appears rock solid. As the global economy continues to evolve, economic and geopolitical uncertainties appear to be on the rise, creating an atmosphere where central banks may continue to seek gold. And one thing I will say that is a common theme throughout this entire video, which is the major point why everything you need to know about central banks and why they buy gold, for the same reasons why you should buy gold. Yes, indeed, and hold gold in your portfolio because it is a way to protect yourself for all the same reasons that I mentioned in this video. So I hope you found this video informative, insightful, and educational. I would like to extend a multitude of gratitude to you all for taking the time to watch and to encourage you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.